with the project and how. So I was the eldest of 4 children born to Irish parents, and my mum developed breast cancer when I was 9. My youngest brother was 4. The operation back then was so butcherous in 1972. And being the eldest, I had responsibilities that no child should have to endure. But even today, all too sadly, there are too many child carers. So my mother, she was a beautiful, meek and mild, devoted religiously. And my dad was on the opposite spectrum. He was an abusive, aggressive gambler and alcoholic, whom she tried to placate at every instance. So I missed an awful, awful lot of school. Even though I was in A stream, my O levels were demoted to CSEs. But sadly, she became gravely ill during exam season, and I missed all my exams bar domestic science, which she insisted that I took because she had dreams of me becoming a hospital dietitian. So at the age of 16, I became aggrieved with God. I rebelled against my father, still trying to look after my siblings. I took work in a factory just so as we could eat. Dad spent all his money on himself. We had no family or outside support. My anger grew into a dark internal rage I could not overcome or control. I medicated on alcohol and sniffed glue, but the dark rage deepened within me, and no amount of self-medication alleviated the pain. And until one day in 1984, when I was 21, I held out my left arm to be injected with heroin, and the hedonistic pleasure was all-consuming. The warmth of the heroin gushed through my veins and became my lover, my pleasure, and my pain for the next 29 years. At 50, broken physically, mentally, and spiritually, I successfully completed a detox here in Birmingham at Park House. It was 2013. Slide 2, please, Jan. During my first year of sobriety, I became involved with the steering group at BVSC, invited with many of the others to give our experiences of services we had all encountered during our traumatic years. It was never quite understood why our input was of so much interest, but as the meetings became more regular and focused, so too was the idea of the lottery funding revealed. And at last, the true concept of the model hit me, and my passions absolutely were enlightened. And I thought, here now, for the very first time, was a service that was initiated by service users and modelled on what way best was to treat and serve prospective new service users. So the BBSC modelled Birmingham Changing Futures service from our steering groups, and we went live in 2015. Slide 3, please, Jan. So, employing lived experience in a professional capacity, in my opinion, was an immense game changer and most pivotal to the success of Birmingham Changing Futures. We with lived experience were paired with professionals that we had back in the steering group, we had so often complained about. We complained because when we were in services, we felt like they just, in inverted commas, they just didn't get us. They all seemed not to understand the implications of homelessness, a lifetime of abuse and poor mental health and offending, or the physiology behind it as to why we may have started and continued to use drugs. But moreover, how to communicate effectively. As we worked alongside each other, we learned from each other. The professional support worker with years of knowledge and experience imparted their skills and knowledge to us, and in turn they learnt the depth and realistic meaning to complex needs and entrenchment. They learned how to speak humanely with our beneficiaries, not at them or to them, not to expect too much or to be aggrieved when the service user failed a proposed service plan of action. They learnt to listen and learnt to nurture their fragile existences. Slide 4, please. Yeah. So the evaluations have measured cost savings, but for me personally, they will never ever be able to capture and measure the intimate and priceless value of what our service users received from our support and interventions. Some service users were so complex, organisations would turn them away and ban them, not knowing how to support them, and they were left to wander aimlessly around the city centre, day after day and year after year, suffering in silence. But these were human beings. And these were our much loved service users, and for the first time in decades, they put their trust in us at Birmingham Changing Futures, allowing us to take their hands and help lead them to what they'd only ever dreamt of. And what a privilege. And it's a moment in time. It's so valuable and precious. How can that be measured? Slide 5, please, Jan. And so that leads me to say, on behalf of all the peers, thank you to the Big Lotto, BVSC, Shelter, Mind and Cypher Fireside. Look where we were, us peers, before employment with Birmingham Changing Futures. We were all receiving benefits, some still living in supported housing like myself, and all of us in early recovery from all of our individual past traumas. We were experiencing the real world for the first time in many, many years, and we were all so grateful and eager that we were able to give something back to society. Most of us had never worked before, and here we were being trusted and paid to do a job that was actually vocational. In Shelter Office, our passion for work was so infectious it rubbed off on staff morale. We all received a very high standard of training, and each and every one of us was given time and encouraged to pursue personal development paths. We have all continued to develop our skills and techniques and have all continued success in the realms of professionalisms. Some now have mortgages, have gotten married and had children, things that once we'd only ever dreamt of. That's also immeasurable. Slide 6, please, Jan. So now I'm managing peers at the Hepatitis C Trust. My lived experience did play a part in my successful application in 2020, but preference being applied to the skills that I'd developed through my role at Shelter, first as a peer, then as a lead worker, followed by development officer post, focusing on systems change and producing the toolkit, which is still available on the BVSC website. At the Trust, we focus on those with hepatitis C, Hep C being primarily contracted through IV use, testing and treating with backup from the NHS, Big Pharma and government in conjunction with a worldwide visual to eradicating the disease by 2025. So no lazy days for me. So as a lead worker, I was paired with new peers, and I found I loved to help develop that raw eagerness peers have into a professional finesse, just as Shelter and my lead worker, Christine Grover, did for me and developed me. Slide 7, please. So I would like to finish with what epitomises Birmingham Changing Futures for me. My much trusted, admired and loved colleague was once a Birmingham Changing Futures service user whom I supported. Having suffered with all 4 complex needs of homelessness, mental health, addiction and offending, we supported him for just over 2 years, and when he was ready to volunteer, he came to Shelter Office, and shortly thereafter he gained employment on Housing First, and he is now with the Hepatitis C Trust. He now has a loving partner and 2 wonderful children, and there are many more, too many to mention. A truly amazing achievement on his part, and it also shows with the correct support, everything is possible. Slide 8, please, and I'll finish here. But there is one last poignant point I would like to make. Excuse me. That is for the lives that were lost along the way. Our only consolation being that they all received the power of that one human emotion we all crave, and that's connection, and may they rest in peace. So today, my motto is, if you find something you love to do, you will never work a day in your life. And that's where I am right now. Thanks to the love, care and development I got along the way from Birmingham Changing Futures. Thank you all very much. Gratefully, Colette Carter. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Colette. That was so moving. Really, really heartfelt, really inspiring, and really moving. And we really appreciate all the work that you've done personally and your achievements. And you know, you're a brilliant spokesperson for all the people who've come with lived experience and really contributed so hugely to the success of the program. So I'm trying to contain my emotions as well. So I'm going to move on to the next thing, but really appreciate that. That was brilliant.
Thank you, Sean.
Simon Bowkett, how can you follow that? Simon is the Senior Advisor for Rough Sleeping Accommodation team at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. So I will hand over to him now and wish him the very best of luck. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And yeah, man, have I got the short straw following Colette. But actually, it's really helpful because a lot of what I'm going to be presenting is kind of fairly big picture stuff in terms of where the government's at the moment in its response, particularly to rough sleeping. Is my presentation loading at your end? Can you see it okay? Because I've got absolutely nothing at this end, so it's not showing for me at all. Jan, did you get the slides through? Are you able to share instead? It's only because I literally can't see the slides at my end for some reason.
We can see the slides. They're up at the moment, Simon.
Okay. Let's see how it goes if I can navigate them. So thanks very much for inviting me today, and I actually feel very at home here because prior to joining the civil service, I've now got a thing saying it can't show the presentation, so I don't know what's happening. Are you still seeing it?
I'll have a go at sharing. It's come off, Simon. I'll have a go at sharing.
Lovely, thanks, Jan. Appreciate that. Right, I should have closed mine now then. Apologies for this. I actually practiced it before this morning. Oh, there we go. So that looks good. Thanks, Jan. Yeah, so I've only actually been a civil servant for a couple of years, and prior to that, I've spent 25 years working in complex needs. So I can't work out if I'm poacher turned gamekeeper or gamekeeper turned poacher. But despite the kind of high level stuff that we'll be looking at in my presentation this morning, the important thing is that we don't lose sight of the fact that ultimately this is about people, and that's why I think Colette's testimony was so powerful. It's also interesting to hear the language of kind of service users, or I'm always uncomfortable when I hear rough sleepers, because these are the kind of labels that we put on people, complex needs. At the end of the day, all of us as humans have complex lives and messiness, and that desire for connection that Colette mentioned. And in fact, at my last organisation, which was a CVS that we then morphed into an organisation called CoLab, which was a multi-agency hub effectively for complex needs. I remember having a conversation with some of our visitors and about our terminology, and said, how do you want to be described? What's the right language? Is it service user? Is it client? Is it, what is it? And they said, well, you could just try people. And I thought that was really quite powerful. And then I said, as a matter of interest, what do you call us? And they said, we call you the lanyards. And that was really interesting, because I think the other thing I kind of want to bring through this morning is we can't lose sight of the fact that whether it's a government official talking to the voluntary sector, or a commissioner talking to a provider, or a worker talking to a client, there are these kind of power dynamics at work, and we need to acknowledge those, try to put those to one side as much as possible, and acknowledge that what we're talking about are systems made up of people. And at the end of the day, it's those relationships that are going to achieve change in people's lives, but also changes in the systems that those people make up. So if we can move on to the first slide then, please, Jan. So as I mentioned, my work now is very much in just one aspect of complex needs, which is around homelessness and rough sleeping. So I work as an advisor in the homelessness and rough sleeping department. We have, I guess, enjoyed a bit of a boost, both in terms of funding and profile in government recently, and that was part of the reason why I kind of made the move across to the civil service from having previously worked in provider services. And if I'm absolutely honest, partly that was around a little bit of fatigue of endlessly working in services that are kind of patching people's lives together as best we can, and then sending them back out to exactly the same factors and circumstances that led to them sort of coming through our doors in the first place. And possibly naively, what I wanted to do was move into an area where the kind of 25 years or so that I've spent working in the sector might be put to some sort of use in trying to actually influence policy. It's never quite that straightforward, but we do have a moment with this government at the minute, because as you'll see there was a commitment made in the last election that this government aims now to end rough sleeping in the lifetime of this parliament. And, politics totally aside, I think there is a genuine desire across government to really see a huge dent in our rough sleeping numbers, if we can't end it fully, to at least significantly reduce it. And there are record levels of investment going into services at the moment. So the graph on the right, you will see that from the historic low in 2010, when there were just over 1,700 people sleeping rough, we have year on year seen rough sleeping increase. This is measured through the annual snapshot, which we all acknowledge is not a perfect measure. It is just that. It just gives an indication of how many are out on the streets on one given night a year. But it's probably the most consistent way that we can measure year on year. And you'll see it peaked in 2017 at over 4,700 people sleeping rough. In 2018, we introduced the Rough Sleeping Initiative, which is one of the largest investments in homelessness and rough sleeping services that this country has ever made. It's an annual fund now of over 200 million. Going into services, especially for those who are kind of at the most acute end of homelessness. So it's pleasing to see that from 2018 onwards, we've seen this sort of steady reduction, and with a dramatic drop in 2020. I would love to say the government can take full credit for that, but of course a large part of that was around the Everyone In initiative as a result of the COVID pandemic. And I know that Shelter and Crisis and others have been very vocal in saying we can't now, having successfully brought so many off the street, go back to how things were. We need to think about doing things entirely differently. Pleasingly, last year we saw a 9% further drop on the 2020 figure. So that's that's certainly something to be welcomed. If we can move on to the next slide, then please, Jan. So what does the government mean by ending rough sleeping? So first of all, I think we all acknowledge that achieving absolute zero is just not realistic. People, for all sorts of reasons, face crises and lives fall apart often very quickly and rapidly. And so there will always be that kind of understanding that for some people in desperate crisis, they may well find themselves roofless. However, what we want to get to is something that we call functional, a functional end to rough sleeping. And we've done some work with the Centre for Homelessness Impact to really kind of consolidate our understanding of what is it that we mean by an end to rough sleeping. So the first thing that we're aiming for is that prevention is always best. It's best for the individual. We know that rough sleeping is a traumatic experience. It adds further trauma. People who begin rough sleeping with one addiction will often end up trying, new substances that they've not tried before, or cross-addicting to other things just to cope with the trauma of being on the street. The health outcomes are significantly worse if somebody has had episodes of rough sleeping. So it's an incredibly negative experience for the individual. It's also not great for the state. Rough sleeping is a very expensive problem to have as a country, and prevention will always be the best value, if I can put it in those very crude kind of public spending terms. So what the Centre for Homelessness Impact has also suggested to us is that where rough sleeping does occur, we should aim for it to be rare, brief and non-recurrent. So it should be exceptional. We want to move away from any kind of normalization of rough sleeping. I think certainly in a lot of the focus groups that we've had on this, it's quite depressing how many members of the public just kind of shrug and say, well, it's an inevitability. We don't believe it should be. We don't want to see rough sleeping normalised in that way. And for brief, this will lead on to the strategy that we have, which I'll explain in a moment. We're looking for the earliest possible moment to intervene to immediately kind of relieve the symptoms of rough sleeping. And then in terms of the non-recurrence, then an understanding that rough sleeping is not going to be solved simply with the provision of housing. The factors that sit behind rough sleeping is far more complex than just an absence of accommodation. In order to support somebody to recover, we have to make sure that their mental health needs are met, that they need, if they need treatment, they can receive it in a timely way for addictions. It's around meaningful occupation. It's around repairing perhaps relationships and links with friends and family. So in order to make sure that people don't return to the street, a home by itself is not going to be the solution. There needs to be a recognition of the support that goes with that. So next slide then, please, Jan. So I also am kind of picking up, I guess, on Colette's last slide. I think as well, there is no room for complacency on our part. The drop in rough sleeping is, of course, to be welcomed. But even when rough sleeping was falling in more recent years, we have still seen, up until last year, a gradual increase in the amount of homeless deaths. To levels that are still unacceptable. And you'll see that by far and away, the largest single contributory factor to the deaths of homeless people is drug overdose at just over 38%. But alcohol and suicide still play a very large part in the amount of premature deaths. The life expectancy amongst rough sleepers is roughly 47 if you're a man, and just 42 if you're a woman. So there's also a recognition that women who find themselves rough sleeping are particularly vulnerable. And therefore, the importance of having gender-informed and trauma-informed responses is really important. So there's certainly been some really encouraging signs in terms of rough sleeping, but definitely, as I say, no room for complacency. We're still losing far too many people to early deaths. Next slide then, please, Ian. So I'm giving you a bit of a sneak preview of a strategy that's going to be announced at the end of June. So picking up on those themes of rare, brief and non-recurrent, prevention, absolutely key. And this is where I guess the discussion around complex needs more broadly comes in. I'm speaking to you from Exeter, where I live in Devon. In Exeter, we reckon about 20% of our rough sleeping population at any given point have been through the local prison in the last 12 months. So across government, we're starting to recognise that if we are going to end rough sleeping, it can't just be the job of the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. There's a role for MOJ, there's a role for Department of Health, there's a role for DWP. We really need to sort of join up. So the numbers of people that are being discharged from hospitals, from mental institutions, from the care system, from prisons or from asylum is still unacceptably high. And we need to do more in prevention in that space. We want swift and effective interventions to make sure that rough sleeping is brief. That means making sure that each area has the right balance of outreach teams, multidisciplinary teams working around that outreach, and then emergency provision and assessment to get people off the streets and to work out very quickly what is it that they need in order to find a sustainable path to recovery, which is the third strand. And then this last bit, just to make sure that we start thinking in a place-based way, and as far as possible trying to encourage system-informed approaches to rough sleeping. I've worked in complex needs, as I mentioned, for many years, but in a multitude of different settings. I'm in Exeter now. Previously, for instance, I worked in Bournemouth, and now in Bournemouth, the criminal justice system isn't quite so much of a driver of their rough sleeping, but treatment services are. Bournemouth has a large amount of treatment centres and aftercare projects, and very often people that have relapsed and are then asked, obviously, to leave those centres, then just stick around in Bournemouth. So the solution to rough sleeping in Bournemouth will be very different to that in Exeter. In London, we've got a very large proportion of rough sleepers who are non-UK nationals. So there has to be a sort of a bespoke intervention there. So rather than trying to have a kind of one-size-fits-all policy and funding strategy from government, we're now starting to work with local areas much more to have a conversation about what is it that's driving rough sleeping in your area, what are the assets and resources you've already got in your system, what are the strengths of the local organisations and charities and peer networks, what role can they play, and then finally, what is it you still need from government and how can we help you to meet those gaps. Next slide then, please, Jan. And so this is my final slide, and really I'll come back to what I was saying at the start in thanking Colette. Why this matters is because this is about people and it is about people's lives. And too often we talk about, you know, the system as if it's some machine, but actually the system is made up of people. Each one of us is, you know, have our own feelings, our own emotions when we engage with these issues. We have our own connections and relationships across that system, and each of us have to make choices about how we approach the other human beings we encounter in that system, whether that's the people who are coming to our services for help, or our commissioners, or our managers, or our colleagues and peers. The system is made up of people, and so ultimately it's going to be about change in people that will affect change in the system. And when I was working at CoLab, we had this thing called service sense but system insanity, and what we meant by that is people in organisations made decisions in their interest and in the interest of their organisation, and missed that kind of wider impact. And the reason I've got it's just a stock photo. It's not an actual client, but the reason I've got a photo there of a woman sleeping rough is because we had we had somebody that came to CoLab called Maria. Not a real name, and Maria was drug addicted, largely to stimulants, mostly speed, but cocaine on her paydays. She had mental health issues that she was prescribed for, but often when she was using stimulants would forget to take her antipsychotics. And she had a mental health crisis and caused about £1,300 worth of damage to the flat that she was staying in. And unfortunately, the housing association who were looking after that flat made the decision that because she had caused this damage, she would have to be evicted, and they sort of made that decision to evict her. Now, you would say from a service perspective, that probably makes all sorts of sense. It was a breach of her tenancy rules and so on. But in the next 48 hours, she was arrested twice, once for assault on a police officer, a second time for arson. The arson incident obviously meant the call out of fire appliances and so on. She was first arrested, then later sectioned. Both of those arrests then led to subsequent court cases. She obviously spent that 48 hours in one of the sort of local mental health clinics, undergoing assessment and so on. And we worked out that in just the 48 hours after being evicted, the incidents around Maria's life and the sort of subsequent costs of the courts and so on would have run to over £35,000 of taxpayers' money. And you sort of go back to that initial £1,300 and you think, couldn't we have done something differently at that point? So I suppose what I'm saying is this is the framework of how government is approaching ending rough sleeping. We are not going to be able to do it on our own. We need to link up with other government departments, but most importantly, we need to work with local areas, with the network of services, with peer networks, and with people whose lives we're trying to help, and never lose sight of the fact that these systems that we are writing policy for and commissioning are made up of people. So it's a privilege for me to be here today. Delighted to be able to present to you, but what I'm looking forward to most, frankly, is listening. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Simon. That was really insightful. And I think I can reflect that we've definitely seen a positive decrease in numbers in Birmingham in the last couple of years of people that are rough sleeping. And we've also seen how the essentialness of partnership work has really contributed to that, and the success of the partnership work that happens in Birmingham in bringing all those services that work with rough sleepers together. And your point about the departments working together, I think, is so critical, and that's reflected on that higher level.